biggest supporters of the US historically, but also at the receiving end of China's provocations in the South China Sea. So I can understand why that sort of informal group exists about the US-India relationship overall in the aggregate versus some areas that it could potentially yield some results.
This was a relationship where both sides were aligned, not just on ideology, not just because they have such vast populations, not just because there are millions of Indian origin people living in the US, but because of China. And now what's happening is a complete 180 where it's India and China that are now being aligned by the same heading, which is America first. But at the center of geopolitics has always been the same thing. Geopolitics is about self-interest. If you were to define what America first means, or what India first means, or if Europe first emerges tomorrow, that's all about self-interest.
This is The Global Gambit.
I guess the other question I'm kind of curious on is how much can India leverage the global south, or BRICS particularly? I do feel that acknowledge the greater role that BRICS has had, but equally I remain skeptical over the sort of immediacy of its influence on macroeconomics, right? It's certainly got more relevance, and there is this idea of disbanding, sort of decoupling from the US dollar, at least in bilateral trade and stuff like that. But how much does India want to leverage that at the expense of the US?
Well, that goes back to an important point that you made, which is that if India is rethinking its future with America, then where does India turn? And there are no easy answers there. There is the Sino-Russian alliance, but regardless of India and China restarting flights, regardless of Indian companies using yuan to buy Russian imports, there's only so far that India and China can go together. These are countries that are very clear-eyed that they're not long-term partners, that their differences are far too big to bridge. Then comes Russia, and Russia's reliance on China is reaching higher and higher levels. Now, Russia, because of the war in Ukraine, 40% of its refining capabilities have been disrupted. So now Russia is importing gas from China. That's a massive shift where Russia is a global energy exporter, and it's now buying energy from China, which is a global energy importer. And this is a new setup. So it's clear that the Russian economic sovereignty and autonomy is being ceded to China. So where does that leave India? Well, that leaves India trying to take its non-alignment on steroids, trying to bolster it on steroids, where it continues to play all sides, but in a far more cautious way, in a far more calculated way. This leads India to trying and use the ideas of economic sovereignty to champion a new vision for the global south, which means connecting with states in Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in South America, in Southeast Asia, on the back of sovereignty, on mutual security and mutual respect. But it also leads to an interesting equation where India, like every other nation, is watching the state of the West today, where the West is very much only in name. It's only the West in name. It's no longer this united, aligned bloc the way it was, the way countless generations, including myself, grew up under, where Western nations stood together. There are now more differences forming than there are areas where these two nations see eye to eye. These nations see eye to eye. Probably the only area where the West is aligned is security today. And that could change in the future too. So India, watching this, where India's largest trade partner is the EU, may seek to make a play for other nations like within the EU, like the UK, within the EU, specifically France, specifically Germany, and try and use these nations to bolster its economy, its trade links with. So this is very much a balancing act. But this is not just about India, it's also about the rest of the global economy. You take a country like Japan, for example. Japan is in the midst of a major political upheaval where the country's next prime minister is unknown at this point after the shock resignation of the last prime minister. Now, right before the last prime minister resigned, he went to India and he signed a deal to double foreign investment within a decade in India. Now, the Japanese outreach to India could take place in a backdrop where the US and India are not seeing eye to eye. So this puts pressure on the rest of the world. The rest of the world is already pressured by the US-China fight to pick sides, to not stay neutral, to block the other out. That was supposed to be the only fight that did this. Now it's the US-India friction, not fight, but friction, that could create equally challenging dilemmas for other parts of the global economy. And surrounding all of that is that India's own neighborhood is undergoing profound change, where it's not just about offsetting America's economic changes with Europe or parts of Southeast Asia. It's also about the new defense and security setup emerging, where Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have signed a mutual defense pact. This is something that's come out of the blue. And what does this mean for the future if India experiences another terrorist attack, if India decides to strike Pakistan? How does this change the dynamics now, not just between India and Pakistan, but also between India and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states? It's the US, China, India that's really defining the Middle Eastern oil architecture. And now, if Saudi Arabia is aligning with Pakistan in this way, this also requires India to change its economic strategy and its geopolitical strategy.
Yeah, well, on that point, although I did a report on the strategic partnership, the security pact between those two, and it got a lot of engagement. People were very surprised to see it, although some people did point out that was it legally binding or not, and what difference would it really make in a sort of scenario where there is potential conflict? You know, are the Saudis going to send military equipment, troops to sort of support Pakistan? And people were, well, again, skeptical over the sort of proficiency of the Saudi military. So, yeah, I mean, I welcome any thoughts from you on that. But as the actual main question I wanted to expand to was, there's a lot of emphasis on semiconductors and obviously the Taiwan Strait, TSMC, and India's role in the Quad. So I was kind of curious for your thoughts on that, also from the technical standpoint, and how that plays into sort of the geostrategic dynamics of the US-India relationship.
Well, this is a very important point, because India's rise is largely being defined by a few areas, and one of them is technology. Now, we start with IT. Everybody knows India for information technology, but now it's all about AI, chip sovereignty, humanoid robotics, biotech. And in these areas, this is where India needs the US. So this again is about a strange, as you put it, push and pull situation, where on some areas, India may want to distance itself or restrict how reliant it is on America. But in other areas, it has no choice, because the only other option for chips is for India to turn to China. Now, if the friction between the United States and India continues to grow over the coming quarters and years, not only will this permanently change the US-India relationship, but it will require India then to rethink its relationships, its partnerships, its outreach to Taiwan, to Japan, to South Korea. And this now will have a cascading effect on how China thinks about Asia, on how China thinks about Taiwan. So what will India do regarding technology? Well, if the situation gets worse between the US and India, if America raises the tariffs on Indian imports, if America refuses to attend Quad or participate in Quad until India meets its trade demands, effectively paralyzing the bloc, if the US punishes India for whatever BRICS does next, then it's technology that India could retaliate on. Specifically, India could force American technology companies to operate a certain way. India could force data that's being collected to be handed over to local companies. Part of that is already happening in India under the banner of what some call techno-nationalism. This is the direction India is already moving in. If the relationship between the US and India gets worse, then these are the kind of ideas that can be put on the table, for the rest of the technology exporting world, specifically in North Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, big questions now emerge if the relationship with the US India is rocking back and forth. Big questions emerge as to whether America will impose export controls on India. This has so far revolved around China. Could it now apply to India? Now we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because there's still a long ways to go before these kinds of cards are played. But I'm just illuminating where things are heading if the situation doesn't improve, if America continues to raise the heat, and because India is no longer the same country it was. And this obviously draws in Quad and BRICS a lot. It draws in these two blocks in significant ways. Quad has really become something that's just in name, especially after the pandemic when Quad couldn't produce vaccines. It wanted to produce vaccines as a bloc. That didn't happen largely because India lacked the manufacturing output for Quad specifically, because India was already producing such high output for the rest of the world. India couldn't also produce for Quad. Now, since then, Quad is really just there. It's just a meet and greet. Will this result in Squad, where the US, that's the name the US has given to US, Japan, Australia, Philippines? Is this going to see Quad replaced with Squad? But this isn't black and white, because now that Squad is being discussed, the Filipino defense chief is now asking for India to join Squad. Whatever differences there were between Squad and Quad are starting to disappear in the blink of an eye. As for BRICS, now India has to think about BRICS through a very different lens. BRICS was about bolstering the growth of the global South. BRICS was about outreach between global South economies. BRICS was about the fastest non-Western economies saying to the West, hey, we're here. Now, however, BRICS is going to become, if India is not careful, another reason for America to collide under Trump. So India has to steer BRICS through America's crosshairs. This is a different dynamic for BRICS than before. And obviously, with China, with Russia, with Turkey as a partner nation, others in the group, Thailand, Malaysia, what India does with BRICS could fundamentally change vis-a-vis America.
Interesting. So you're pretty bearish about the Indo-US relationship in the short to medium term, by the sounds of it. I have to say, I've never heard of Squad before, but one has to wonder the same geopolitical weight, military weight it would have. No offense to the Philippines, but they're not India. And I mean, they're one of obviously the biggest supporters of the US historically, but also at the receiving end of China's provocations in the South China Sea. So I can understand why that sort of informal group exists. So you're very simply then, you're very pessimistic about the US-India relationship overall in the aggregate versus some areas that it could potentially yield some results.
I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic. I'm just a realist as to the state of the relationship today, because this is a relationship that was supposed to be limitless. This was a relationship where both sides were aligned, not just on ideology, not just because they have such vast populations, not just because there are millions of Indian origin people living in the US, but because of China. And now what's happening is a complete 180 where it's India and China that are now being aligned by the same headache, which is America first. And that is a big shift that has not received enough attention. So I'm not pessimistic that US-India relations are falling off a cliff, or that US-India relations are effectively up in the air, disrupted permanently. I'm just very aware that the trajectory they were on is no longer the trajectory they are on. And what was supposed to be limitless now appears to have ceilings. Now, can these two nations fix this, solve this, resolve their differences? Absolutely. but it's going to require a Herculean effort from both sides. It can't just be that Modi goes to the White House, sits in the Oval Office, and laughs with Trump, and that resets US-India relations, because that is all optics. It's going to require a major push by both sides, perhaps a new project, a new agreement, a new bloc that both sides found, that both sides drive, to make Delhi and DC see things the way they used to see things. Short of that, this is the direction we're on. This is going to take place, however, over years, if not decades. This is not something where next year India is going to sign a mutual defense pact with Russia, and India is going to formally join the Sino-Russian alliance, and India is going to abandon its non-alignment, and India is going to give the West the cold shoulder. That's not at all what I'm saying or what's on the table in the short term. But we are going to see more fluidity in terms of geopolitics and economics, and in terms of alignment between the US and India. And that's going to have a cascading effect on the rest of the world. As I said, before it was US-China fight, there's something happening with ports, there's something happening with rare earths, there's something happening with investment policies, there's something happening with immigration. Now it's the US-India fight, which is largely centered on those same topics. Just look at the H-1B challenge in the US, where $100,000 fee for every new H-1B application. 70% of H-1B applications go to Indian nationals. And now this is going to have an effect on remittances, on services exports from India. So we're at the very beginning of this new path. Is there room for both sides to lock hands and walk into the sunset as they were, or as they may have been characterized as being? Yes. Is there a high probability of that? I would give it 50-50 right now.
Well, okay. Certainly Trump is a businessman. You're someone who understands business strategy. And, Modi likes to demonstrate that he can continue to build on the economic progress that he has led in the past 11 years, right? India has a lot of troubles, but you can't deny that the economy has been significantly reformed and advanced under him. But, to be devil's advocate for my final question to you is, China wants to do something over Taiwan. There's a lot of concern over the South China Sea. There's a lot of concern over a revisionism, revanchist tendencies amongst, various member states, but that includes China. What would India have to do? What would it choose if it came between its security and the threat of Chinese expansionism, or US economic, inconsistency, if that makes sense?
Geopolitics has always been hard to define. People have talked about geography, people have talked about power. In recent years, it's been about technology. But at the center of geopolitics has always been the same thing. Geopolitics is about self-interest. And even more so today, it's all about self-interest. The entire, if you were to define what America first means, or what India first means, or if Europe first emerges tomorrow, that's all about self-interest. So if China makes a play on Taiwan, and remains a big if, although the likelihood continues to grow with each passing year based on the comments and posturing and military buildup in China. If China decides to make a play for Taiwan, India's reaction will be entirely based on self-interest. That is the unfortunate part today, where relationships, alliances, including in the West, which were supposed to result in nations tackling the same challenge together beyond the lens of self-interest for some kind of long-term geostrategy for a specific world order to remain intact. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. That depends on wherever the time zone somebody is in. That's gone. And now it's all about, will I gain or lose by taking X decision? And in the context as it stands right now, I don't think India is going to get involved militarily if China makes a play for Taiwan. Even if America asks, I don't think at that time, especially if the Indo-Sino economic integration has accelerated and is now critical, even more critical than it is today, I don't think India is going to sabotage that over a Chinese play for Taiwan. And just to give some thought on the Taiwan question, there are a lot of analysis and simulations of how China may invade, but really all China has to do is blockade the island. And that puts the ball in the court of the US and Japan and puts Taiwan in a very dangerous situation. So even before an invasion, a hard invasion begins with drones and missiles and troops and bombs. If China blockades Taiwan the way it has done in its drills, that will equally put the question in India's court and in the court of the entire global economy.
It certainly will. And that's what we always have looming in the background of this channel, but many other places. To quote one rather dark person, well, someone's rather dark quote, Ukraine is but a warm-up. Taiwan is the proper theatre. But that's certainly not how we look at it here. But it's what, well, you have to keep in mind in the greater strategic chess of, well, global gambits, as we say on the global gambit. But Abishur Prakash, it's been an absolute pleasure. Mr. Geopolitics, should have taken that name myself. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll be sure to have you back on, maybe for a deeper dive on a specific angle or for a review of certain developments in the future. And thank you very much for coming on. Everyone, if you enjoyed the show, then do give it a like, do give it a subscribe to the channel, and of course, do check out Abishur's wonderful website and fantastic work as well. And we'll see you all next time. Take care. Thank you, mate. It was really...